Welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Aida Jairo. You should see on the screen my colleague Milda Zelinskaite. And we also welcome our wonderful panelists, Mauro Guillén from Wharton Business School, Renate Meyer from Vienna University of Economics and Business, Jason Gagnon from the OECD, and Philip McCann from Alliance Manchester Business School. Welcome.
The title of today's webinar is Global Cities, Migration and Business. We are co-hosting it with the Center for International Business at the University of Leeds, also known as CBUL, and the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development at the World Bank, which a lot of you may better know as NOMAD. And we would like to note that we have received a message from the Office of the Federal President of Austria, Alexander van der Bellen, regarding this webinar. This is a direct translation from an email in German that we received. The topic of migration and the reduction of inequalities is very close to the President's heart, and he welcomes the fact that the topic is being addressed in detail and across borders through this webinar. Best wishes and success for the event. And we also wanted to share that in addition, during the preparation for this webinar, we were in touch with the mayor offices of several major global cities, and we had received some responses from the mayor of Sydney, Clover Moore, and the office of mayor of Toronto, Olivia Cho. Unfortunately, they could not join us live because of scheduling conflicts, but their offices also send us greetings and wish everybody a good event. So welcome once again.
So we have 4 stellar speakers today, and we are also very happy to see the variety and range of expertise among our audience. So we know that you cannot see each other, but to just let you know, we have received around 250 registrations for this event. We had a quick look earlier today, and our rough estimate is that about 70% of you are academics, and the rest represent intergovernmental organizations, World Bank, OECD, business firms, government authorities, and NGOs.
Yeah, and to maximize our time with our speakers, we will provide only very brief introductions today. Most of you probably know our speakers from their work anyways. Unfortunately, our very first speaker today, Mauro Guillén, could not join us. He had a last-minute travel request, but he sent us a recording of his presentation yesterday. So Mauro is a professor of multinational management and vice dean of MBA program for executives at Wharton Business School. And you may have read his book 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything, which was a Wall Street Journal bestseller and a Financial Times Book of the Year. So we will now stream his presentation.
Hello, I'm very sorry I couldn't attend this event in person. However, virtually it would be. A last-minute work trip came up. But I would like to tell you my thoughts or some thoughts about global cities, immigration, and business. You see, cities in the world have been growing very, very quickly. Back in 1960, there were only 2 cities in the world with more than 10 million people. That was Tokyo and New York. Only 2 cities in the entire world with more than 10 million people. By 1970, we already had a 3rd city, that was Osaka in Japan. So Tokyo and Osaka in Japan, and New York City in the United States. Notice that at the time, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, Latin America didn't have a single city without more than 10 million people. By 1990, now we have LA and we have Mexico City, Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo in Brazil, Mumbai and Kolkata in India. And in addition to Tokyo and Osaka in Japan, we had across the sea, we had Seoul in South Korea with more than 10 million people. But still, as recently as 1990, no cities in all of Africa with more than 10 million people. Now, as of the most recent year for which I have these maps created for me, we already have a tremendous urban growth in many parts of the world, especially in Africa, the Middle East, South Asia. Look at India now, how different it looks like from 20 or 30 years ago. And then what is the projection to the year 2030? These are medium projections by the United Nations. Well, by that year, we're going to have about 35 cities in the world with more than 10 million people. And we're going to have probably around 300 or 400 that are going to have more than 1 million people. A majority of the world's population, for the first time, more than 70%, will be in cities, living in cities. And this was a moment that we crossed, a very important moment, back in the early 2000s, the first few years of the 21st century, when we had, for the first time in the world, more people living in cities than living in the countryside. Now, global cities. For me, global cities are cities whose importance, and more importantly, identity transcends the country in which they're situated. So New York City is a global city. It happens to be located in the United States, but it is a global city. The same goes for London and several other cities around the world, which I would classify as global cities. Now, Saskia Sassen, one of the most important theorists of global cities, says that this is the place where the work of globalization gets done. So globalization is about forgetting localities, but global cities play a critical role in globalization. What are the crucial dimensions of global cities? Well, the economy, finance, politics, culture, and of course, diversity. So some of the features of global cities, in my view, include they tend to be large, influential, and prominent. They're culturally and ethnically diverse. They also thrive on culture. They have museums, they have music, they have universities, they have schools. They tend to have advanced infrastructure, although in some global cities, the infrastructure development has fallen behind. They're rich in business services, all of those services that cater to the needs of other firms, such as consulting, IT, and so on. They tend to be open, friendly, and safe. And lastly, they're legally and politically secure, although that, of course, depends on the country in which they are situated. Now, what are the drivers of global cities? Why do we have global cities? Well, we have global cities due to what economists since Alfred Marshall have called agglomeration economies. That is to say, you cut costs. It's more efficient to have certain activities co-located in the same place. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, you have in these cities the growth of specialized service firms that cater to other businesses. And so more businesses are founded in those cities where they have these business services clusters. There's also places, the global cities are places that coordinate dispersed activities. So many companies coordinate from their control centers in global cities, their far-flung operations around the globe. And then lastly, of course, we have the effect of new communication technologies that have made it on the one side, easier for companies to locate wherever they want in the world. But at the same time, then, it's also made it possible for companies to have their major decision centers in global cities and then to have dispersed operations around the world. Now, I believe, and this may be controversial, that there are three types of global cities. We have truly global hubs, such as, I believe, London and New York. Those are the only two truly global hubs, in my view. And then we have regional hubs, such as Singapore, or Panama, or Miami, or Dubai. And then finally, I think we have gateways to a hinterland, like Hong Kong for many years, not any longer, but for many years, was the gateway to China, to mainland China. And Sydney is the gateway to a country that is like a continent, Australia. Now, a couple of other thoughts that I wanted to share with you. One has to do with remote work. I think remote work, which is a trend that will continue, especially in its hybrid form, I think will represent the apotheosis of globality, because we're going to have global citizens, global workers, but living anywhere in the world. We're going to have, in other words, distributed work. And of course, it has also given rise to the phenomenon of the digital nomads. And there are all of these medium-sized cities in the world in very attractive locations like Boulder, Colorado, or Barcelona, Spain, that have become magnets for relatively young people who don't want to be in just one place all the time, who want to migrate one place to another, but yet be able to work for the same employer or in the same line of work. And then one final point about immigration, which I think is really, really important. You see, there are limits to the so-called sanctuary cities, which is a phenomenon that is really, really important both in Europe and the United States. But immigration is a very important factor in urban renewal these days. This is quite visible, I think, in many of those ethnically dominated neighborhoods in some of the world's megacities, like New York or like London. But we also see this in smaller cities. In one of my previous books, 2030, I recounted the example of Buffalo, New York, where immigration from Ethiopia, Somalia, Laos, Myanmar, and Serbia has essentially created so much urban dynamism and has led to the renewal of many derelict parts of town. So what will the future bring in terms of global cities, immigration, and business? Well, I think we are moving towards more of a network of cities rather than global cities. We're going to see constellations or alliances of cities, thanks in particular to remote work. I think immigration will continue to be a relevant factor, even if it declines. And I am convinced that ethnic diversity, linguistic diversity, and just in general diversity will be a key characteristic of global cities looking towards the future. So thank you so much again for your attention. And my apologies for not being able to attend this event on during while it is being staged. Bye-bye.
Our next speaker is Renate Meyer. Renate is professor at Vienna University of Economics and Business. She is also the head of the Institute for Organization Studies and co-director of the Research Institute for Urban Management and Governance. So Renate, over to you.
Thanks so much, Aida and Milda, for the organization of this event and the invitation to speak here. So migration is at the same time an urban phenomenon in that it manifests increasingly in urban areas, and cities are increasingly at the forefront of having to manage migration. So they are actually the place where migration plays out on the ground. So they are at the same time an urban phenomenon, but they are a transnational and multi-level governance issue. Why? Because the causes for migration, they are transnational and mostly outside the reach of the cities that actually deal then with the migration. They are multi-level governance issues because the rules and regulation that regulate migration, they are not made by the cities, but they are mostly national rules and regulations. And thirdly, they are beyond the scope of the cities to accomplish, to manage, especially all the integration and inclusion, and they require intersectoral collaborations and also the help of international and supranational organizations. So at the same time, an urban phenomenon, but a very complex transnational and multi-level governance issue. The super diversity, and Mauro was also speaking about diversity. So the super diversity that is driven by migration is a clear asset for cities, and his talk was referring to that, but it is also demanding for urban governance. And I will speak about such demands for urban governance today. Migration is, as we all know, multi-dimensional with very many different types of migrants. And that can be the causal dimension, for example, the corporate-driven migration from above versus the inequality-driven migration or forced displacement, climate-related migration, wars, etc., polycrisis that are more push factors for migration. Or the geographic dimensions, and we also saw the different centers of migration, the bilateral movements, international movements, etc., or internal displacement and migration movements as well. All these, so as multidimensional as all these types of migration and the different migrants that therefore come to the cities, as multidimensionals are the demands for urban governance. So this is a complex matter, and it is not a matter that can be kind of dealt with, I don't know, 10 points fit all situation. So 10 kind of recommendations that will be the same for all types of migrants, for all causes of immigration, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to be a bit more specific to deal with the question of urban governance and migration. Just to give you an example, if we think of expatriates, international headquarters, etc., and the demands on urban governance, it means that the cities need to be attractive business location. They need to try to attract international organizations, or in terms of professional, highly skilled professional migrants, they need to try to validate their skills, acknowledge their degrees, etc., as we see happening, for example, in the health sector, where so many cities actually are trying to attract professionals and highly skilled migrants to come. A different type of migrant that is not really actively sought by the cities, and where the migrants often either work in very precarious jobs or are not allowed to enter the job market at all, is the refugee area. So this is forced displacement. These are people who leave for all kinds of factors, such as war or climate change issue, etc. And for cities in particular, the large number of refugees that come in a very short period of time are quite a stress test. And when I was invited to this panel, I was asked to speak in particular about some projects we did and some observations and learnings from these projects with regard to governance challenges concerning handling of large and big refugee streams. And our projects there, we were dealing especially with the large number of refugees in Europe in 2015. So that's the time period. And our studies were mostly done in Vienna. And while Vienna has a long history of integrating and welcoming refugees from Eastern Europe, because of the history we share with the empire, or in the Hungarian uprising or the Prague Spring, etc. So there's been a long history of kind of integrating and including Eastern European refugees. The challenge with the Syrian refugees was a different one. Yeah, that was a different story. And as we can see now, is the Ukrainian refugees is again it's from the east, so it's a different style of integration than we had then. So I want to highlight 3 learnings and 3 points here. I mean, there's a lot to say, but I will focus on these 3 points there. Cities have different opportunities and challenges in such situations than the rural surrounding areas and than the national level government. And that results very often in quite substantial tensions with these rural surrounding regions and the national government. Why is that the case? Because the cities, they kind of need to deliver the service on the ground, as opposed to the national government, who is not as close to the people than the cities are. And they have to do that in much larger numbers than the rural areas. The laws and regulations, so asylum policies are national laws, though. Access to labor market are national laws. So the national level kind of makes the rules of the game, and the cities actually need to enact it. Cities also very often have a different electorate and therefore different political orientations than the rural regions around them, because they have a different kind of political clientele and inhabitants there. So in our case, there were quite considerable tensions between the surrounding state and with the national government. And that was quite heavily also debated in tabloid newspapers and was quite a tension at the time. And what proved to be more fruitful than actually engaging in these tensions or trying to resolve them was for the cities to collaborate with some of the agencies and to collaborate with other cities. So city networks in that sense proved to be more successful in collaborating and in exchanging data and in coordinating moves, etc., than was the attempt to kind of try to work with the national government or with the surrounding city. So alliances with agencies, networks with other cities nationally and especially internationally are more promising than relying on collaboration across the multi-levels of government in the home country. That will be my first learning and takeaway. The second is city administration and service delivery is itself organizationally fragmented. Again, why? This is decades of new public management inspired reforms have resulted in either privatization as well as in a large number of autonomous or semi-autonomous organizations with very different legal forms, governance structures, even if they're owned by the city. They have all kinds of different legal forms and structures. This, of course, undermines the city's capacity to act and requires a lot of coordination. So there's a landscape of organization that, for example, owns the lands and actually provides the services. And they all have their different boards and structures. So going through the formal channels and boards takes a lot of time and takes a lot of efforts to coordinate. And that's too much time if emergency accommodation, transportation, etc. is needed now. So what they need to do is to find a swift way of coordination. And in our case, that was done by the installation of a coordinator very high up in the hierarchy who would report directly to the CEO and the mayor, and with a clear backing and direction from the top, but a lot of leeway in handling. And this coordinator, of course, can do a successful job only if they know the city structure very well and if they know the people in charge. And that is not very easy to find. So it requires a network within the city and cohesion inside the city. And all these kind of things are features of what we call a resilient city. But if like these kind of conditions are given, then you can overcome the fragmentation that has been caused by decades of decentralization and autonomization of the actual core administration. And my last point would be, this is a task that exceeds the capacity of the city because it requires too many services that a city cannot provide, starting from materials, food, translation, psychological services, and many more. So intersectoral collaboration is needed. And that means that the right private sector players and the right non-profit players need to be brought on board without the time of long deliberations and negotiations. And secondly, that citizen bottom-up involvement needs to be enabled because the city needs to make it possible for the citizens and the inhabitants there to actually own the situation, to collaborate with the city on these things. So what this means, it requires the capability to embrace distributed sense-making and leadership and polycentric decision-making. And this is not per se the easiest thing to do for a bureaucracy. And it also is in tension with the rule of law maybe, or the liabilities that may be incurred, compliance issues, accountability of the city government and administration, etc. So this kind of dispersed leadership. So two takeaways from that. The first requires the mobilization of long-standing ties with mutual trust. And it is good if the city has this collaboration and these ties and networks across the sector, so with the private sector and with the non-profit sector. And the second requires the ability to revert the iron cage of bureaucracy, but not by removing the bars or violating the rules, but by turning them into the guardrails of a protected space within which this citizen kind of engagement can happen. And that requires great deftness with bureaucratic rules. So the abolishment of bureaucracy is not the way to go, because it would kind of violate the rule of law and all the kind of basis upon which the city works, but it requires kind of the creativity of assembling the rules in the way so that even the citizen participation is covered. Let me give you an example. In the situation, one of the civil society organizations, they were not even an organization, they were actually a virtual collection of people. They offered childcare in a parking lot, which is of course a nightmare in terms of liability. Yeah, what happens if one of the children kind of gets hurt, etc. And the city in really no time managed to cover this kind of childcare facility within the insurance scheme of their own kindergartens. So they were covered, they had professional staff there. Of course, the easiest way would have to just stop it, yeah? So not provide this service, not allow it, but they decided to go a different way of trying to kind of figure out ways of covering them. There are many more points to be made, but I want to leave it at this point in time. Maybe one limitation is I was talking about managing this kind of swift period of refugees entering. There's a long way to go to integration and inclusion of all these people within the Austrian society.
Thank you so much, Renate. Yeah, we actually have some really good questions in the chat for you already. But we will be collecting them during all the speakers' presentations, and we'll pose them to you at the end of today's session, well, in the Q&A session. So now I'll head over straight over to Jason Gagnon. Jason is a senior economist with the OECD Development Center and heads its unit on migration and skills, which produces policy reports and coordinates its policy dialogue on migration and development. And Jason also co-chairs one of the thematic working groups, so a thematic working group on special issues at Nomad. Jason, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Milda. And let me just share my screen because I have a little presentation that I will use. There we go. Everyone can see that? Yes, okay. Okay, thanks. And thanks for the introduction. It's true, I had a unit on migration skills at the Development Center. The OECD Development Center is a place or a unique place in the OECD which works with, particularly with developing countries. So it's not the typical place within the OECD. We work directly with governments. This isn't the Development Assistance Committee. This is directly governmental support. And I also co-chair, as you said, a Nomad working group. And some of this work I'm going to speak about today leverages some of the work we've been doing that. So thank you for the invitation. The entire body of work that I'll be presenting today is in collaboration with two of my colleagues, Saed Etajari and Elena Caravigno, and primarily features work on the African continent. And I want to underline that because of two things. One is, as I mentioned earlier, we work primarily on development. We work primarily on international migration, although a lot of what I'm going to say today, and on occasion, we also work on internal migration. And we work on the global and regional and national governance of international migration, but a lot of this pertains to cities, and cities, as we know, are very much at the core and center of this discussion on international migration. Most migrants go to cities. So I wanted to set a little bit the general context of where we situate ourselves on this question. And as it's already been highlighted, there are lots of different transitions, lots of different movements in globally, but particularly in Africa, and they pertain to demographic changes. And I'll come back to that in just a second, but they also pertain to all kinds of other things which influence migration. One of them is technological. It becomes much easier, perhaps even cheaper to move around, much quicker. There are changes in the aspirations of people, and especially young people, to migrate. There's changes, and that's related to this. There's changes in the education level of people. And so they become much more attractive outside of their country. There are major transitions within the country which influence the demand and the supply for skills. Those might be digital transitions. They might be the green, quote unquote, transitions. There are differences, or there are changes on the income levels. And so some countries are becoming richer, and that doesn't necessarily, as some people might think, stop or reduce migration, at least in the short or medium term. And so we're seeing lots of mobility. And within all of this, we also see some countries restricting migration. So this distorts a little bit where people might decide or might be able to go to. But I just wanted to underline the demographic part of this whole discussion because it's really, really blatant and very influential. And that's the African continent is growing very fast in terms of number of people. And I've posted here how much that growth has looked like compared to other regions of the world and how it's projected to grow in the future. And you can see that Africa is growing not only faster, but will continue to grow faster than other regions of the world. And that means there's a lot of young people and young people looking for jobs and young people that are educated and have aspirations and growing aspirations for their livelihoods. This is another way to look at it. But here again, you can see that Africa, the growth in Africa's population is primarily big. I'm not going to post the urbanization rates, but you can imagine that those rates and those trends look very similar to this. So the cities, as the first speaker mentioned as well, the cities are growing in tandem to these trends. And this isn't particularly just an African story. It's a low-income country story in general. And here is the plots if we look just at the income levels of those of the demographic growth. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this has implications for migration in all sorts of ways. It has implications on the demand and on the supply of skills, but it also has demands on where people might be able to migrate, where they may aspire to migrate. And we know that in some particular countries, restrictions are growing on where they might go. And there's increasing amounts of pressure on the internal mobility in Africa. And this has increasing amounts of pressure on the cities in Africa. And I'd like to explain this narrative, this presentation, by showing and giving some examples of how it will be increasingly important for Africa to leverage these skills and to create mobility across these skills for its own growth, for its own aspirations, for its own objectives, particularly with respect to its free trade agreement that it's currently rolling out. However, the story is not so clear and easy at the moment in Africa. Africa has Africa, first of all, has the lowest mobility score if we calculate the mobility scores by visa-free travel or not, or by mobility scores created by passport indices. It has the least mobile score, so it's particularly entrenched on itself, but it also has the least amount of mobility within its own continent. So especially young African people that have aspirations to move, have particularly very high constraints, not only to leave the continent, but even to leave their own country and stay in the continent. And this is obviously an issue for the growth of the continent, and also for the growth of these young individuals who may or may not find jobs within their countries, and particularly, again, to the cities that are going to be growing and will have all these needs in terms of skills. I'm sorry for that, the fact that this slide is half in French, half in English. But not only, again, are the restrictions particularly high in Africa in terms of visa or not, or mobility of or usability of a passport, but the visas are also the highest in terms of cost for African countries, for sub-Saharan African countries, but also for North African countries. So again, not only are they restricted, but they're also more expensive. They're restricted in terms of the expense of how mobile they may or may not be. And this, despite the fact that they're mobile, we looked at LinkedIn data. And as I mentioned earlier, some of that demand for skills will be on green skills and digital skills. And we looked at LinkedIn data from 2015 to 2019. This is obviously a major demand in terms of future growth across the world, really, but particularly in Africa, where they're trying to kickstart their economies, again, particularly in the context of the free trade agreement. And we find here that not only are African countries retrenched, but when they do migrate, they actually are negative. These are ratios between inbound and outbound skilled individuals that have what would be termed green skills. And you see that most African countries are losing some of these key skills. And it's also true when we look at what would be termed as digital skills. So they're entrenched. They're not necessarily to be mobile. They're not necessarily able to be as mobile as they would like. And when they are mobile, African countries are losing key skills for their economies. It's also interesting to look at whether this is driven by openness to foreigners in Africa. And here we've plotted immigration policy preference according to employment sector. And even the private business or an industry sector, which you would imagine would be rather open, is a little bit, relatively speaking, restricted or has restrictions on foreigners, except when jobs are available, which I guess is consistent with what you would imagine from the business sector, but it is still quite restrictive. And this is particularly also, it's not plotted here, but compared to other regions and other countries of the world. However, in general, when we're talking about very much economic context of allowing foreigners, for instance, to trade, the African countries, this is all of them amalgamated together, but by different sectors, whether they're self-employed, private sector, NGOs, or government, are relatively all rather open to foreigners trading. So when it really becomes down to an economic argument, the openness seems to be much broader and much more receptive to immigration. So I'd just like to conclude here by pointing out some of the policy options and the way to look at this going forward, or let's say the implications that should be addressed. The first, and this was particularly addressed already by Renate, which is there's a disjuncture between coordination at national and local levels. Immigration is particularly governed at the national levels, yet it's the cities that deal with the integration, and it's the cities that have a different narrative and a different demand and supply structure than the national governments might necessarily see. Yet they don't control any of the budgets, and they don't control any of the policies that have to do with migration. And it was very interesting. For us within Nomad, we ran a project on transit migration, and the discourse that we were getting at national level was particularly different, which was closed, was particularly different from the narrative that we were getting in cities that were particularly much more open and particularly much closer to looking at what are the durable solutions that we could turn to turn this into something that could eventually benefit us. The second is prioritizing migration. What do I mean by that? Well, if we're going to think about the policies that might influence immigration or attractiveness or anything that might be related to migration, the ones that are the most important are not the ones that are particularly directed at migrants or at diasporas or at return migrants or at immigrants. They are the ones that are generally across the different sectoral ministries or across different thematic areas of government. They might be financial, they might be educational, they might be agricultural, but those are the policies that really have the most influence. The general climate of migrants and refugees in across the country. And where might you turn to coordinate and to prioritize those types of issues? The highest order of planning and strategizing in a country are the national development strategies. They're typically run by prime minister's offices or presidential offices. And so we looked at 150 or so national development strategies across developing countries. And it's not as bleak as you might imagine, but only about half of the countries refer to migration in any way, shape, or form. But that reference is, first of all, not always turned into a positive benefit to the country. And second, there's a big gap on, and this goes back to the beginning of what I was saying through this presentation. There's a big gap on issues related to immigration. So developing countries have traditionally looked at immigration as something that they could turn to for their diaspora. They might turn to for return migration. They might look at for remittances, but immigration and how you might integrate immigrants in developing countries is rarely a priority in most countries. The good news, and this is the third point, is on attractiveness. So attractiveness, again, is something I would say which is cross-sectoral, it's cross-disciplinary, it's cross-ministerial. There's two ways that I would say are particularly interesting for attractiveness. The first is, and this is an easy sell, I think, to a lot of countries, it's diasporic engagement and diasporic investment. And there I have some particularly good news. This is an area that is highly referenced in national development strategies, first of all. It's particularly highly referenced in Africa. And when we look at national development strategies over time in the same countries, we see that the reference rate is increasing. So it's something that has a positive trend and that countries generally see as something of a very positive, of a positive nature. Again, to go back to point one, these are national development strategies. They're rarely directly connected to cities. And so there's still that disjuncture between how do we move that to a structure which makes sense for cities as well. The second is on attractiveness, which I mentioned earlier, is rarely ever prioritized and ever even referred to as in a positive light in national development strategies. I'd like to end to say something quickly about leveraging skills across cities, and particularly across African cities. It's something I mentioned earlier. African countries are particularly losing key skills in digital and green thematic areas. And so it's particularly important for them to obviously invest in this. But to go back to the point 3 that I was mentioning earlier, turning to the diaspora is a way to counter the fact that people are leaving, and leveraging the diaspora that have those skills is a way for countries, especially African countries, to not only bring back those skills, but also create pathways in which people might be able to circulate or share and leverage those skills in their countries. Just one quick figure on this I just want to show, which is I'd like to end on a positive note, which is if we look at the enrollment in African countries where we do have data in STEM skilled areas, it's rather actually positive, and there's an increasing amount of enrollment in these countries. As you can see, I've posted a few of these examples here, but the increase from 1 year, from 2017, sorry, I can't really see which 2 years there are, but from 1 year to the next, you see that there's an increase in the number of enrollment in STEM skills. I'd just like to point out one last figure here that I just want to show because it's important in terms of the mobility and the challenges that are faced in Africa and African cities, which is if we look at the outbound of African students across time compared to the rest of the world, you see that the rest of the world is particularly increasingly mobile. There are lots of students that are moving to other countries, whereas in Africa, this has pretty much flattened out since about 2008. But what's particularly distressing for African countries that need these skills, as I was mentioning earlier, is that when we look at how many of those students stay within Africa, that rate is decreasing. So a particularly high rate of sub-Saharan African students are leaving to other regions and other continents for their studies. That's not necessarily de-stressing if Africa can somehow end up leveraging, again, their diasporic links and the links with those students eventually. But it's something to obviously monitor if Africa keeps losing the skills that they need for their future growth. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jason. This was very insightful. You can see the discussion that has been triggered by your presentation in the chat. So our next speaker today is Philip McCann. Philip is one of the most highly cited regional economists globally. He's professor of urban and regional economics at Alliance Manchester Business School. Philip has served as an advisor to two European commissioners, the European Commission, the OECD, and the European Investment Bank. Thank you very much for joining us today, Philip. The floor is yours.
Well, firstly, just thank you for inviting me. I have to apologize. I'm sucking a cough sweet. I have a terrible cold at the moment. So hopefully I can get through it in 10 minutes, but I do apologize. So over the last few decades, I've published a range of papers on issues related to migration, particularly interregional migration, a little bit on international migration. I've done a lot on cities, including on global cities. But I think the situation we find ourselves in today is a lot of this has become a puzzle. Now, a lot of these literatures, the kind of modern views on global cities, modern ways we think about particularly interregional migration, was really framed in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And that world doesn't exist anymore in terms of how our economic systems function. And so today we find ourselves where we are struggling to try to understand how the systems have changed so profoundly. And that's with regard to both labor mobility and also cities. So to explain this, my background is I'm now working at the headquarters of the Productivity Institute in the United Kingdom, which is a UK-wide program involving many, many different universities, plus also a lot of international partners. So I work with people like Tony Venables, Bart Van Ark used to be head of the conference board and so on. So it's a very multifaceted research program. So the central issue that I'm looking at these questions on now is in terms of productivity. To what extent do cities and their functions and behaviors and labor mobility in and out of cities drive productivity issues? And there's three elements to this argument as far as I can see. One is the changing role of cities, and I mean in the last 15 years, fundamentally different. Secondly is the problem of scale. How we understand scale has changed dramatically as the changing role of cities has emerged. And thirdly is the question of our policy responses. Where do we go from here? So on the changing role of cities, what we see when we look across OECD-wide data, that's what I tend to focus on, the OECD-wide literature. The first thing is that there are different experiences in different countries. So a simple way to categorize countries in terms of the growth patterns within those countries and how they relate to cities and mobility is you can think about countries which economic growth is metro-led. It's been led by the very large cities versus where growth has been led by cities and settlements of all sizes, small, medium, large. So one would be metro-led versus diverse. The second one is where the growth is spatially concentrated in particular regions of a country rather than being quite scattered and diverse. And then the third one is the convergence versus divergence. In terms of the patterns, the typology of growth across the OECD, today we have 8 different types, and they are spread quite evenly across OECD countries. Whereas the literature that emerged in the 1990s and the early 2000s posited 2 basic frameworks. One was that growth was driven by cities, and particularly large cities. And secondly, the underlying economic frameworks were fundamentally still about convergence. So it's okay for people to move to large cities because that will eventually raise the supply price of factors in weaker places, and you will end up in a convergence type of framework. This is a model that goes back 50, 60, 70 years. And that was the kind of thinking you see, for example, in the 2009 World Development Report, Reshaping Economic Geography. And if you look at economics, and particularly regional and urban economics in the 1990s and 2000s, there were so many papers about convergence following the work of Barrow, Salim Marty, and others. Today, the world doesn't look like that. 55% of OECD countries do not experience interregional convergence, they experience interregional divergence. And in terms of the triumph of the city type narrative, the idea that you've got nationwide convergence processes which are driven by large cities scattered across the country, which would be the United States around the turn of the new millennium, that accounts today for less than 10% of OECD countries and actually only 4% of the OECD population. That was the dominant typology in terms of how people thought about these things. It is the absolute limited exception today. The world simply does not look like that, and we are struggling to understand where we go from here. The second part is the problem of scale, which is related to it. In those days, we were talking about large cities driving growth, but now we know that is not what the data tells us. It tells us that growth patterns are much more varied. Zipf's law, for example, argues that the growth is independent of scale, and actually we find it a lot of the data. We find it in financial pricing data. I have a paper that's just come out in the Journal of Economic Geography with a group of co-authors, Michiel Daams, Paolo Veneri. It's called Capital Shocks and the Great Urban Divide. And we use uniquely detailed financial pricing data to show how markets price cities. It's extraordinarily detailed. And what you see is there's no scale-related effect at all. None, zero in the financial markets, except when you get an adverse shock, such as the global financial crisis. Thirdly, many countries have generated growth without scale. And of course, Austria is an obvious one. The Nordic countries, the Netherlands, you don't have the scale effects that you would get in the narratives of the United States, Canada, Japan, and so on. There are basically none. There's something to do with networks, connectivity, which of course was a key element of global cities. And going back to the original global cities arguments, many global cities are not very big. They're between 1.5 to 2 million and 4 million people. And of course, Vienna would sit in that group along with Amsterdam, Stockholm, Helsinki, Singapore. There's numerous examples here. They are highly connected, but it's not about scale. It's about connectivity, and that's a different issue. There are very large, highly connected cities, London, New York, but many cities, which are highly connected global cities, are not big. So growth mechanisms in those countries seem to work in different ways. The problem is the previous way that all the literature was articulating these things doesn't help us to understand these different cases. The final part is the question of where we go from here. Now, this is both an intellectual question and also a very real policy and governance question. Firstly, the intellectual question. When we have underlying frameworks of our economies are about interregional divergence, not convergence, the problem then is, as policymakers and also as analysts, is that we have no idea of the outcomes of our policy recommendations. Because in the old days, when the underlying mechanisms of the economies were interregional convergence, which was the case for almost every single OECD country up until the new millennium, then if you increase spatial concentration in certain places to drive agglomeration effects, in the long run, that would not have adverse consequences on weaker places where people have moved away from. That's the standard one sector convergence framework. The problem is when you go to a world of divergence, you have no idea of knowing what those effects are. So if people leave weaker places to go to stronger places, there's no obvious self-correcting mechanism. What you can get is greater and greater divergence. So the whole question of spatial concentration, including global cities, starts to become extremely difficult to understand analytically. And in the real world out there, people know this. The geography of discontent tells you that. That was a phrase that I actually coined the day after Brexit. And I used it at an OECD meeting 4 days later. It's now used by the European Commission, the OECD, the Brookings Association. What does it come from? In 2016, there were 4 cases. One was the Van der Bellen-Hofer referendum in Austria. One was the Brexit referendum. One was the Trump election. And one was the Renzi referendum in Italy on the constitutional change. In each of those cases, the geography of voting patterns almost exactly reflected the economic geography of growth in those countries over the previous 20 years. In the case of Austria, interregional differences in Austria by OECD standards are tiny, but people in Austria feel them profoundly. And growth in Austria is entirely an urban phenomenon. It is entirely a large city urban phenomenon in the United States. It's not an urban phenomenon, it's a very large city phenomenon. So what happened was in the Van der Bellen versus Hofer referendum, all of the urban areas voted Van der Bellen, and the greater was the size of the city, the more was the votes for Van der Bellen. In the United States, as far as it's only Fort Worth was the only city over 1 million people that voted for President Trump. And that depends on the boundary of the city versus the county. Every US city over 1 million people voted for Hillary Clinton. Richard Florida sent me all those data. In the UK case, the geography of growth is not about cities. It's not even about London. It's about the core periphery structure of the country. And that was almost exactly reflected in the Brexit vote. And in the Renzi referendum in the same year, it was a north-south split, where people were voting against Renzi and in favor of the leggier politicians, many of whom in the past had been, in a sense, anti the South. But the South was voting for it. This is what happened in Brexit. It's what Paul Collier talks about as a mutiny. People just react against the situation. Of course, the Gilets jaunes in France, it's almost entirely urban versus rural. That is the geography of growth in France. That is not the reality of the UK. So the point here is that we are now in a situation where we don't understand the implications of the underlying forces driving these different patterns of growth. We don't understand the role that cities play in it. 15 years ago, we were fairly confident that we did understand. Now we're not confident at all. There's more and more gaps in our knowledge that we don't understand what to do with it. And so we have a kind of an urgent need to try to rethink these things, both conceptually, analytically, and also what does that mean in terms of where we go in terms of policy making. And the best example of this is the paper by the NBER and the Brookings paper by Benjamin Austin, Larry Summers, and Edward Glaser. It's about place-based policies, jobs in the heartland. Read not the NBER version, read the Brookings Wharton papers. In the summer, the spring of 2018, not the paper itself, read that, but read the debate afterwards. That is the most illuminating thing I've read for many years, that people are really struggling. Very, very esteemed scholars are all struggling to try to understand what situation we're in today. And my final case here, in one sentence, the developing world, the industrializing world, the recommendations of the World Development Report in 2009, grow those cities. Good argument. The problem is today, even the World Bank acknowledges a huge problem in these countries is what the World Bank calls sterile agglomeration. Huge growth in population with no growth in productivity or incomes. Is that a good idea? People have been encouraged to move away from their own communities, and in the end, they end up being trapped economically in exactly the same situation they started from without all the support of their families and communities. But these are very, very profound challenges. We face this not only in developing countries, the newly industrializing countries, but we also face this in the OECD countries. That the world that we thought we understood 15 years ago was shattered by the global financial crisis. That world doesn't exist anymore, and we are really struggling to understand the role of migration and the role of cities in those processes. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Philip. This was a very fascinating presentation. Thank you very much for joining us today and for this presentation. So I will now invite all the speakers to answer the questions. We have some questions and we have also some questions from the chat, and we have been people have also approached us before we started the webinar today with some questions. And one of the people who approached us is Eno Konzara, who is the founder and CEO of Mint, a fintech company based in Exeter, UK, and Nairobi, Kenya. And Enoch wanted to know what are the projected labor gaps in the advanced economies, and are they expected to be filled by migrants from Africa? And how are the current demographics likely to influence the migration of African skilled labor? This could be a question for Jason or Philip, so maybe Jason would like to start.
Thanks. That's actually a really good question, and something we're actually currently working on. We've been mapping the different skills demands in different regions of the world, not necessarily where they would come from, or not necessarily where they come from, but we could imagine where they may come from. I wouldn't even say it's particularly strongly a European demand. There's demands for these types of skills in all sorts of countries and all sorts of all parts of the world. One of the areas where the demand for these types of skills is increasing is in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and we're working now on the eventual implications and the partnerships that could be built around the GCC and African countries, for example. But we are also seeing lots of middle income countries with shortages in certain fields, Turkey, Mexico, just to name a couple of them. The types of skills, as I was saying earlier, tend to fall in either highly technical, highly digital technical skills. We see a lot of programming demand for programmers, I mean, and then demand for very specific green skills, putting together solar panels, for instance, those kinds of things. I think, and I was just about to post this, I was writing a reply to someone who asked something similar. I think one of the interesting developments in this area over the last 10 years has been this idea of skills mobility partnerships. These partnerships that are jointly built between sending country and receiving country, in which the receiving country trains a certain number of people in a skill that's in demand in both countries, and then creates a sort of labor market in partnership with private sectors in both countries, to create not only immigration and fill shortages, but also to create some mobility and some skills in the origin country. It's not a perfect model at the moment, but it's still, there's a lot of reflection on this in the moment. And it's something that is more advanced than I would say in European countries. Germany and Belgium and France and Italy have programs like this. But it's something that we're, for instance, having discussions with Gulf Cooperation Council countries to put the same thing together for India. And the view that we've had on these is that it shouldn't necessarily just be a one-way discussion. It's not, our view is that it's not enough just to say we're going to create all these skills in the home country or in the origin country. You need to connect that with the demands in that country, the labor market demands, but also the types of objectives that country might have for its economy going forward. And then again, we this seminar is about cities, connecting it with the demands at the city level, and how the cities might necessarily eventually be involved in these things. The other issue, and sorry, and I know I'm taking a lot of time. The other issue with these programs is they particularly tend to be small, and so and a little bit expensive. So there's lots of discussion about how to bring a bigger role to the private sector, because private sector would obviously have, if there's a gain for the private sector, they would find ways to make it affordable, but also to scale it up, to eventually make it big enough to be worth the while for these partnerships to continue. And then maybe, sorry, one last final point is that one of the big issues with skills mobility is the transferability of credentials. So this is another way that these programs tend to help in that manner, because the training is done directly from the receiving country, so the credentials are maintained from that side.
Thank you so much, Jason. And trust me, no answer is too detailed here, especially because we haven't had an expert on the African continent in our previous webinars. So we can see that your talk generated a lot of interest. I have another question from Enoch, who, as we said, shared the questions with us earlier today. And it's on a different topic, but we found it very interesting. So maybe Renate and Philip, because you're based at universities, you could share your thoughts on this. His question was, how can universities support entrepreneurs whose businesses serve migrants or employ migrants? Is there a connection between academia and business in this sense? So any thoughts? Maybe Renate, if you'd like to start.
I mean, I guess it's not only the universities who could support these entrepreneurs, but it is a broader societal task to do that. But clearly universities could, by offering all kind of support that they need, but that's equally a task that I would say is related to the cities where they are or the regions where they are, and also non-profit organizations should support them. But so I think it's important, and I mean, of course, the self-employed and percentage of migrants is high. I mean, for whatever reasons, we could discuss that, and entrepreneurship is important. So I think universities can help and should help, but not only universities. It's not only their task, but there should be many players who actually support that. I mean, and the support that they could get is help with all the bureaucracies, rules, how to register, all kinds of skill deficits that they may have in relation to the national regulations and so on. So plenty of opportunities and multiple players who could actually step in here.
Thank you very much. And Philip, we don't know if you'd like to also comment on that one.
Just briefly, I agree with Renate. I think that's exactly correct. I think universities do have a role, but it's within a broader institutional landscape. It depends on what resources and also legal powers that the universities are granted and how they interface with other institutions. I can only speak on behalf of the university I'm part of, the University of Manchester, but is very active in this regard. They do a lot around supporting young entrepreneurs, particularly university graduates, young graduates who have ideas to start businesses. So there's a lot of mentoring schemes that take place, networking, and so on. But there's also a specific focus on ethnic entrepreneurs. So first and second generation communities, migrants coming in from different parts of the country, different parts of the world, at different periods, because they often have different market niches, different areas where they see opportunities for new entrepreneurship, new trading relations, and so on. So there's a lot of engagement in this arena. But I think Renate is correct. What tends to happen at Manchester is this takes place also in conjunction with the city regional authorities. So you're starting to build kind of syndicates, groupings of institutions who can provide different types of support, evidence, advice, mentoring, networking, but in a way that's also targeted to the opportunities that those particular groups of entrepreneurs are aiming at. So I think this is an area, certainly within the business school world that I'm teaching in, this is a really big area that people are focusing on now, because they can really add different dimensions in terms of product diversity, new market access, trading relationships, and so on.
Thank you very much. We have also a question from Joe in the chat. This is a very broad question, so to any speaker, which migration-related SDG targets are you most optimistic about reaching by 2030, if any? And do you happen to know any research that combines SDG 11 targets on cities and SDG 8 on decent work and employment and SDG 10 targets on reducing inequalities? So any of you feel free to comment.
There's a lot of cities working in this arena. I mean, if you just go, for example, in the case of the European Commission, you go to the European Commission websites, DG Regio, you go to the Committee of the Regions. There's a huge amount of work in this arena. But I'm not aware of anything particularly that also connects with migration. There probably are such things, but I wouldn't say that. I'm not particularly aware that that's a kind of a key strand. I think where there are movements in this direction, I think it also links to the previous issue around also engaging different communities in different aspects of the economy, including entrepreneurship, things like that. I don't think migration, I'm not aware that migration itself is explicitly related to those issues.
I mean, I would say that there's quite a bit of research on all kinds of inequality issues, and also related to the SDGs and of course, like all the governance and so on issues that are also covered there would be related to that. And what a lot of research there does with regard to inequality is also focus on certain gender issues, and especially migrant women, and how they have unequal opportunities to be integrated, to receive all kinds of support, that they, many of them kind of, they're excluded from all kinds of language courses, etc., and so that and enter thereby in a vicious cycle of kind of being alienated by their countries, and very often, and how that kind of then affects also second generation migrants. So I think there's quite a bit of work, and also a lot of work, especially focusing on the inclusion of women with migration background in these areas. And to come back to the entrepreneurship topic, a lot of that is related to ethnic craft and entrepreneurship. So there are several explicit kind of initiatives trying to target that, and there's also some research on this kind of specific ethnic craft with the purpose also to inclusion and integration of female migrants in this family. So I think there is lots of streams there, but it's probably not enough. And I agree that it would be great to see more on that topic.
Thank you so much, Renate. And you actually answered the question by one of the participants. Huri actually asked about any insights about gender, cities, and migration. So we're very glad you touched upon that. The chat is really on fire. So we thank everybody for that. And we're just trying to pick the questions that are kind of the broadest and the most applicable to everybody. So there was a question from there were questions from Kathy Liu and Christina Popescu, but Jason already answered those in the chat. And the one we wanted to pick here was from Anderson. He's talking about global workers. And he asked what could be the impact of working from anywhere practices, which are increasing by day, to issues like diaspora effects, brain drain, and brain circulation. So anybody who would also maybe like to pick on that, any of the speakers, it's a big question, and I know we can only touch the surface of it.
I might start with another question, because I wanted to share something on gender, this idea of gender in cities, and then I'll come back to this, and I'll answer also. There's a question on climate, which I can say something to. On gender, we don't necessarily work too much on this intersection, but I did have a discussion. We work on transit migration. I had a discussion with one of our partners in Morocco, who was telling me something which I found quite eye-opening in terms of how being a woman might change the way you approach policy, especially in transit migration. He was telling me he runs a daycare in a city in Morocco, in two cities in Morocco, and he was telling me that they're faced with one of the reasons that they started the daycare was that they were working with transit migrants that were basically transiting through Morocco from sub-Saharan Africa. And he came across many, many women who were falling deeper and deeper into poverty because they had to tend to their children, and so they couldn't work. And when they had free time, they basically couldn't mobilize themselves to get work. And so it was, for me, it was a pretty easy example, because this burden often falls on women. It was a good example of how women are somehow sometimes need a different policy approach in terms of city migration, because this was at the city level or the local level. And he was just showing me how this has become one of their successes, is that many of the women and the children that they work with, many of the women were able to then find themselves some sort of livelihood. Some of them have actually stayed in Morocco beyond their plans, which was to continue to Europe, because they were able to somehow integrate themselves into the labor market, thanks to this daycare. And of course, the daycare, with the help of local NGOs and also with the help of the city, in one of the cases, is able to function. On the question of climate, I just wanted to say one thing which links this to cities, which is we did the same exercise I was mentioning on national strategies, national development strategies, but with national adaptation plans and national determined contributions, the two COP documents that came out in the last few years about how countries will mobilize priorities and resources on addressing climate change. And we were particularly interested in how the question of forced displacement due to climate change was addressed in these plans. And it turns out that there are only about 1/3 of countries who refer or address these in their national adaptation plans. And this is across the board for future flows, but also for current flows, so current refugees that are in cities or in dire situations due to climate change. And this is particularly distressing because national adaptation plans is precisely the channel through which you mobilize resources to address these issues, not just mobilizing ministries and policies and different levels of government, but also specifically unlocking resources in the country to do this, and also mobilizing donors to galvanizing donors to work on this. So this is an area we're actually organizing a COP event around this topic to see what countries are doing and thinking about this in next week, basically, that I can share it with the organizers if they want to share it with everyone. And then the last question was on this idea of global workers. We haven't had too much reflection on this, but I think it's really something that we probably should be thinking more about. I think it might put particular stress on embassies and consulates, which are required to protect people, while these people might be basically anywhere. But I think there's also, and I think it was said this, I don't know if it was the question or the moderators that said it, I think it also it opens doors for opportunities, because if these people mobilize anywhere or are located anywhere, then it becomes yet another link for that country to leverage, to tap on, to create links, to create trade links. And that can only, in our experience, be a good thing for both countries if it's done right.
Thank you very much, Jason. We had also one question from Charles, and this may be a more controversial question. Charles wanted to know, will fully remote white-collar jobs be automated by Western states through artificial intelligence to prevent the dispersion of such jobs to non-Western nations? I don't know if any of you would like to tackle this question.
I think there's a couple of different things. When we think about artificial intelligence, there's so much chatter about it in the media, a lot of which is very confused. When I talk to people working in big data, natural language processing, a lot of them, their view is, well, we're already doing all this stuff. It's not that. So there are different views on these things. I think it's useful to separate the change in work practices connected with the lockdown the COVID lockdown that most countries faced, the work from home revolution, using exactly what we're doing now, using Teams and Zoom and Google Meet and all of these, that potentially has big implications for how countries function, and also potentially for migration, because previously for many kind of activities, people would have to migrate to certain places or certain cities in order to access certain types of jobs, markets, networks, and so on. It is possible that those relationships have been somewhat altered by the ability to work more from home, remote working, or at least a kind of a hybrid where people work part of the week from home, part of the week in an office, and so on. Those implications do seem to be things which are happening in different countries, but again, in different ways, depending on the geographical structure. In terms of artificial intelligence, if I think about the stages of kind of technological shifts in the last 20 years, most of the shocks of modern globalization and technological advances in the OECD countries have basically been borne by the middle income groups, the middle classes, the middle income, middle management, middle skills. The lowest income groups have largely been unaffected by those shocks. Slight effects, sometimes up, sometimes downwards. The high income groups have been overwhelmingly the beneficiaries of those technologies. So you get this huge job dispersion, but what you get is a hollowing out in the middle. And a lot of the political shocks I referred to earlier are really related to those groups. Now, they've clearly been the losers. I mean, you see the elephant curve distribution, for example, that's where this comes from. But where artificial intelligence is going to change these things, we don't really know. There are many arguments that artificial intelligence is likely to impact much more on higher skills jobs with kind of, cognitive, non-cognitive type of interfaces, where the nature of the job is much more customized, it's much more specific, it's high variability. Many people argue that artificial intelligence is going to do that. I don't know. I have to say, I was at an OECD meeting very recently, and one of the speakers just did a little test. And what they did was they gave the title of the paper they were about to present that we'd already seen and we had to critique. And this person put it into ChatGPT and asked it to come up with a paper. And on first glance, what it produced was incredible. But the more you looked at it, the more you realized it doesn't say anything. What it was basically a lot of cliches that were kind of stuck together that reminded me of a kind of a weak undergraduate essay that somebody's written at the last minute. And so I read that and I thought, I don't feel so threatened by AI if that's what it's producing. It's actually not that sophisticated. Now, that's only a one-person experience in one case. But I think really the key thing is which income groups are likely to be affected and how does that affect the kind of implications in terms of urban growth and migration. And at the moment, the real answer is we have no idea. No one has any idea.
Thank you so much for taking the heavy task of tackling this one, Philip. And Renate, you also had a comment.
Yes, thank you. I mean, to the question of the global remote worker and the implications, I think that one angle of this that we should not forget, of course, is like it sounds very promising. You have you do need to migrate for jobs and so on. But I think what we need to keep in mind is what does this mean for labor laws and regulations? So is this an undermining? So what, according to which kind of labor regulations are these people employed then if they work remotely? Is this kind of precarious jobs that increase here, and then it looks a lot less kind of promising? Is this preventing all kinds of unionizations and so on, which in industrial relations actions, etc.? So I think there are many downsides to this idea of the remote global worker that we should not kind of forget with all the promises of kind of, oh, I can work from home or whatever. There's a lot of implications, and especially poorer people with lower skills in precarious situations are the least likely to gain a lot from this kind of development. So we should be very careful not to kind of think of us working at home when we think of these kind of developments.
Thank you so much. And judging from the chat, people would like to continue for another hour, but we've promised everybody that we'll finish on time, which is in about 2 minutes. We really wanted to raise a couple more questions. You know, there was one on the resistance toward immigration, which is probably, you know, it's a foreseeing the future question, whether that will increase in the cities or decrease. There was a great question on Latin America by Valentina here more toward the end. But unfortunately, we'll have to wrap up. We will save the chat, so then we'll let the speakers know what all the questions were in case they'd like to think about those after the event. But I want to thank all the incredible attendees one more time. You have been a wonderful audience today, and for this, to the speakers for really thought-provoking conversations. And I also want to thank Joe and Jasper. They're here behind the scenes. They're from the University of Leeds, and thank you for your backstage support. And also thanks to our partners at Nomad at the World Bank.
Yeah, I mean, we are sure that this will inspire many of the members of the audience to work on important issues at the intersection of global cities, migration, and business. I can see this from the questions in the chat. I think there are also many interesting future potential papers here in this chat.
Yeah. And if you'd like to be connected or be invited to the next webinar, which will probably be sometime in spring or early summer, or access a lot of useful resources, we recommend checking out our website. I posted the link to it in the chat. And thank you once again for joining us today.